So good morning, and I want to give a thanks to Karen, Dr. Murphy, for organizing this and inviting me here to share some of my work, and also to her team, especially to Heather, who is amazing and pulls everything together really well and makes you look good. So let me start with my talk. So I want to spend some time this morning sharing what I view as the relationship between critical race theory, gender, education policy, pedagogy, kind of education broadly. If you notice, I don't know if you all can you read that? Okay. So Toni Morrison, for critical race theorists, we draw interdisciplinarily, and Toni Morrison's work has been fairly influential in terms of thinking about how race operates as a construct, and what are those constructs that have helped to kind of create categories of race. In particular, she argues that the U.S. aesthetic has kind of created blackness, and that a notion of the American identity and whiteness would not exist without this kind of black other. So we draw on her work extensively. And so what she's arguing in this particular piece is that, that we become so focused on racial tropes that we get to the point where we can't even engage in our work because we're always speaking against the tropes that are cast against people of color. And so what would our work look like if we could just exist and create in our cultural practices, in our racial practices, and not be placed against whiteness? So I want to talk about intersectionality that has kind of taken up a lot of space in social science research and in cultural studies in particular. And we tend to think of intersectionality only tied to critical race theory, but I'm going to argue that it existed before Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term. So this is Joyce Ladner. She's a sociologist who wrote extensively about this notion of black sociology. And so she kind of lays some early groundwork on this notion of looking at race and its relationship to gender, such that black women could become a subject separate and independent of black men, that they could become a subject separate and independent of white women, that black women could stand as a single subject, and we could examine their experiences, their aesthetics, their creativity as subjects that stand on their own. So what is critical race theory? Critical race theory is a interdisciplinary field of study, if you will. We're relatively young, started in legal studies, but draws on what my colleague Kevin Kumashiro calls post-perspectives, postmodern, post-structural, post-colonial, and history, women's studies, ethnic studies, literary theory, philosophy, et cetera, queer theory, and takes a critical stance toward kind of normative ideologies that, again, cast people in particular, speaking against kind of discursive categories. CRT has its origins in the law and emerged in response to the neo-Marxist critical legal studies movement in the 1970s. Critical legal scholars were mostly Marxists who were critical of US jurisprudence and argued that remedies to address class disparities would also address all disparities. So if we could address class, we could eradicate sexism, racism, ableism, et cetera, that everything boiled down to class. For critical race theorists, for critical legal studies scholars of color, they began to push back against this notion that class trumps everything. And so Charles Lawrence argues that critical race theory focuses on the persistence of conditions created by and traditionally associated with racist practice, as opposed to liberal theory, which promotes the equality of individuals. If you create a structure, everybody will thrive in a structure. It's just creating the structure. Through process, critical race theory promotes substantive equality as a result of legislative and judicial action. And I should put a note here that now we're kind of pushing back against judicial and legislative action because of the failures that we are seeing, I would say probably since the Obama administration. The ways in which the courts and our legislative branch have served to perpetuate racist policies and practices. So we're seeing now that the legislative branch and the judicial branches are not necessarily the answer to addressing inequality. By reflecting the perspective of the subordinated, critical race theory articulates a theory of equality and human dignity that is grounded in anti-subordination policy principles. So in the law, this notion of discrimination, primarily they use discrimination, they also talk about anti-subordination, so subordinating people through legal or illegal practices. Mari Matsuda, a founder of critical race theory, suggests that it is organized around 6 basic tenets. Some of you who are familiar with CRT may know these, so I won't go through all of them. They're here on the slide. But 2 that I think are important to name: that racism is endemic to American life, and that we're skeptical of this notion of neutrality, objectivity, colorblindness, and meritocracy. In critical race theory, we draw on constructs, although I will say my colleague, Danny Solarzano at UCLA, Danny thinks more fluidly and uses CRT more fluidly than using the traditional kind of constructs. I'll say I was trained as a music theory major when I got my degree. So I work in key signatures. And so I think of these constructs as key signatures. We operate in a set, in a kind of a boundary to make sense of and look at different phenomena. So some of my CRT colleagues don't necessarily play in these key signatures. They work outside of them, and that's okay. There are other ways of thinking about CRT. In education, we have tended to use CRT to understand kind of 3 primary ways. How does race and racism, how is it endemic and significant in American schooling, public schooling? And some of my colleagues have looked at private schools and the perpetuation of racist practices. Education is a property right, not a human right, and you'll hear rhetoric about your zip code shouldn't matter where you live, while also kind of hijacking civil rights language. We've seen neoliberal ed reformers use this notion of your zip code should not matter while they're also creating structures that are inequitable. High quality education intersects with race and property rights. And my colleague, Will Smith at the University of Utah, had put forward this notion of racial battle fatigue. And so despite kind of Christine Sleeter's recent erasure of these scholars, so Christine Sleeter has been very famously writing about the CRT attacks and positioning herself as a CRT scholar, which she's not. She erased Gloria Ladson-Billings and Bill Tate when they introduced CRT to education in 1994. They argued that race was under-theorized in education and that explanations for educational inequality failed to consider the impact of racism on the educational outcomes of students of color. Celia Rousseau and I argue that there are boundaries around CRT in education, so we're limiting as CRT scholars in education. We argue that if one is going to take up CRT, they need to think about these kind of boundaries, and we borrow this from our colleague in the law, Devin Carbato. So one, CRT in education argues that racial inequity in education is the logical outcome. It's not an aberration, a logical outcome of a system of achievement premised on competition. So if we have a limited number of slots for admission, how are we going to decide this? We begin to use competitive metrics to determine who's in and who's out. And we argue that that then sorts people, and people of color, and particularly African Americans, and we can look at the affirmative action data now, will always be on the outside of that. CRT in education examines the role of education policy and educational practices in the construction of racial inequality in education and the perpetuation of what I describe as normative whiteness. CRT in education rejects ahistoricism and examines the historical linkages between contemporary educational inequity and historical patterns of racial oppression. And many who, and I'll talk a little bit about the attacks on CRT, have tried to dehistoricize contemporary issues so that we no longer need affirmative action. We no longer need the Voting Rights Act. We no longer need admissions, to look carefully at admissions policies in elementary ed. And so those are, again, they're dehistoricizing remedies for historical inequality. CRT in education engages in intersectional analyses that recognize the ways that race is mediated by and interacts with other identity markers like gender, class, sexuality, linguistic background, and citizenship. And finally, our last boundary is CRT in education agitates and advocates for meaningful outcomes that redress inequity. CRT does not merely just document disparities. CRT scholars in education have engaged in scholarship that critiques the liberal ideology of early multicultural education scholarship, examined the school curriculum as a form of property, for which access to high quality and rigorous curricula is afforded primarily based on race, examined the impact of affirmative action in school desegregation policies, analyzed the inequities in school funding, and looked at the relationship between colorblind ideologies and teachers' pedagogies in low-income schools, and has argued for this notion as we think about research on critical race methodologies. Okay, so this is Kimberly Crenshaw, if you didn't know her. Is credited with coining the term intersectionality in her 1989 article. So it's not new, even though this term is new to our kind of public discourse, Kimberly introduced it in 1989. Demarginalizing the intersection of race, sex, and Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist politics, that was published in the University of Chicago Legal Forum. And so she argues that intersectionality rejects this kind of single access framework, that we, again, only look at people as either raced or gendered or able-bodied or English-speaking, but that we think about the way these things cross to understand and analyze the experiences of women of color. And she was specifically naming women of color because in our anti-discrimination law, women of color often don't figure, again, as Joyce Ladner pointed out, as independent figures. If something happens to me, it also has to happen to someone who is either a woman, i.e. a white woman, or a man, i.e. a Black man, because I identify as a Black woman. But my experiences as a Black woman aren't what the courts call cognizable, because they are not, I can't stand independently as a subject. And so Kimberly was arguing against this kind of single access analysis. And so I'm on the wrong thing. So she argues that the multiple axes of discrimination encountered by women of color in employment, the family, and elsewhere, intersectionality has found broader application in efforts to move beyond single issues and identity approaches to marginalization. Again, although Kimberly coined this term, the idea of intersectionality, again, preceded her work. And her work was informed by sociologists, primarily Black women sociologists, who again wanted to argue this notion of the complexity and the nuances of race and gender and class status. Deborah King is another sociologist who actually created the model race plus class plus gender to further articulate how we might think about these subjectivities. And Gloria Anzaldúa contributed this notion of thinking about sexual identity and border crossing, so the borderlands and the mestizas. So this idea that these identities are also culturally informed, and she was specifically looking at Chicano culture. Jennifer Nash, more contemporarily, has pushed us to think about CRT, intersectionality, with what she argues, a complexity of identities, that ultimately intersectionality seeks to demonstrate the racial variations within gender and the gendered variations within race, through its attention to subjects whose identities contest race or gender categorizations. So where have we, there's a song by Natalie Cole called Catching Hell, and so that's where I took this from. Everybody's catching hell, ain't nobody by themselves. So some areas of attention for Black women and girls when we think about the research. In education, we could look at, and increasingly, some scholars are looking at school discipline. The rhetoric and the research has promoted this notion that school discipline policies only impact boys and boys of color, but the newer research is looking at, again, how these school discipline policies impact girls of color, and in particular, school dress code policies. Black girls have been punished for hairstyles, primarily the way that their grooming practices, and so how is that captured in school discipline policies when they're sent home or they get, and some schools get a demerit. So again, how are we capturing these things? Degree attainment, do we have a sense of, although we know that Black women attain more degrees than any other group, how does this degree attainment impact then employment opportunities and wealth attainment across the lifespan? Health disparities, there's some wonderful research on, while we, again, talk to Black women that's very sexist about getting married and having a family, what one of my colleagues, Mignon Moore, found that Black women, when they get married, their life expectancy drops by 50%. When Black men get married, their life expectancy increases by 50%. So when we tell Black girls they need to get married, we're actually, essentially consigning them to a shorter lifespan and considerable health disparities. So how do we look at cancer, heart disease, et cetera, the labor market? One of my colleagues is looking at Black women's experiences as K-12 teachers as they go through the labor market through their lifespan as teachers. So where has intersectionality kind of traveled? It's traveled vastly. Kimberly is coming out more kind of talking about to remember the original subjects of the intersectionality, because they're often, again, rendered invisible even in our now contemporary discussions about intersectionality. So Black male studies, Devin Carbato and Athena Matuna wrote about this notion of multidimensionality. LGBTQI scholars have picked up intersectionality to, again, talk about the nuances of race, gender, and sexual identity. And then Leslie McCall is a political scientist who's tried to operationalize quantitatively intersectionality in the voting practices, the political practices of people in general. Intersectional connections, so have you all think about kind of how do we think about intersectionality and its impact on education policy, pedagogy, curricula? In what ways could we reread our foundational research on policy, pedagogy, and curricula as examples of research that is intersectional, or where they have quote unquote intersectional failures? So where have we not been able to, through our foundational research, which then informs it's generative, how have we then failed to take up the nuances of race, gender, class, linguistic background, et cetera, because we haven't attended to these intersectionalities? So how can we operationalize intersectionality in our research? We can move beyond the kind of simple equity statements and diversity statements and look at outcomes. So how are we operationalizing this in a real way? What are our outcomes? How are intersectional policies really yielding something for us? Recognize and value Black women's labor. How does the scholarship and or voices of Black women manifest in our teaching and our curriculum and our policy? How do we represent Black mothers, sisters, aunties, grandmas, daughters in our research? Do we show the fullness of Black women in girlhood? Do Black girls get to be children and be joyful, inquisitive, innocent, sassy? Do we get to talk back to power? Do we listen as researchers? How do we revise or discard curricula and teaching practices that have inequitable outcomes for subjects that we value now and see as intersectional? We can operationalize these ideas through valuing, centering, recognizing the cultural, that the cultural practice and aesthetics of a group are what inform our epistemologies. So James Colmore has passed on, but he was a founding critical race theory scholar who reminds us about the notion and the importance of our aesthetics and how it informs our epistemologies. And he says, a very personal expression, our epistemologies, our cultural expressions, are very personal expressions that allows our experiences and lessons learned as people of color to convey the knowledge we possess in a way that is empowering to us and, as is hoped, ultimately empowering to those on whose behalf we act. Similarly, we need to remember that all of our work is merely a synthetic form at best. What people of color want and desire for their children, their schools, and their communities, are we capturing that? We have to think more deeply about how we work in partnership with those on the bottom, students, communities, and families. And Mari Matsuda reminds us, she's a critical race theory scholar, that we need to look to the bottom. Looking to the bottom provides a historical perspective that suggests that divergent strategies for change can converge triumphantly for activists who keep sight of common goals. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do you mind if we open it up for questions? I'm
Sure.
happy to sort of navigate that review, and I think we have just a few minutes.
Did I go over? Okay.
Yep.
Questiones? Yes.
So, thank you for your presentation. What research was used to determine that Black women's lives are decreased?
So you want to know what data she used?
Yeah. And yes.
So it's Mignon Moore. She's a sociologist. Where's Mignon? I don't know where she is now. She was at Wellesley, I think. So she's a quantitative scholar, so looked mostly at, so it was secondary data analysis, looking at, I think the database was probably an NIH study, and, looked at an HLM, ran an analysis to see kind of, and the limitations of quantitative only give you trends, right? So you can't absolutely say what the causes are. But it looked like when you looked at Black women who were married, when they got married, their health outcomes dropped. And for Black men, their health outcomes increased. So it's just a correlation, right? We don't know what the causes are. But the argument is that we probably should consider more carefully what we counsel young women to do when the trends are that when you marry, it's likely that you will take on a bigger bulk of responsibilities that can impact your health outcomes. But I would challenge you to go find Mignon Moore's work. It's Mignon, and her last name is Moore, Moore.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You've been encouraged to use the microphone, so.
Nobody else is going to talk. I don't like that space. So I'm going to go with my voice. So a question for you. So thinking through all of this, and the need to think about intersectionality, what is when you move from theory and research and into implementation and practice, what is one key thing that curriculum creators and enactors need to do to be more mindful of the positioning of different people based on sex?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when I say the fullness again, do we show Black women's, or do we show Black women in families, Black women as workers, Black women as students? So to what extent do we show, again, the fullness of the experiences of being a woman of color, as opposed to locking them into single experiences? A mother only, someone who only is a chef in a cafeteria, someone who only works in housekeeping. Can we, and that's kind of the class piece that we don't see again. Black women from birth through the end of life as full people. They get locked, this kind of, what Peggy was reminding me, this freeze frame. They get freeze framed, like you're only this, and that's all that we know about you. But we don't see people grow up. We don't get a sense of the impact of other people in their lives or other experience, that for good and for bad. It's not all tragic, right? So typically the images of black women are always as these kind of tragic victims without agency, and so that's the kind of fullness that I'm talking about.
So if I think about that, right, one thing that we could all be mindful of in our practices is we have to bring trajectory and context. It's not enough to put a picture on a slide,
Yeah.
right? You have to unpack that picture and think about
Yes.
the details
Yes,
more about it.
yes, 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 yeah, yeah. There's a question way in the back. That's Grace. Hey, Grace.
Thank you. I'm Grace. I'm from Higher Ed. And Dr. Dixon, I have a question for intersectionality. So, actually,
It's
when we are, so in representing intersectionality, there is a popular way of combining race and gender.
Right.
Would you find that class, LGBTQ, this ability?
It's great.
Okay. Is this better? Yeah. So, would you find that, like, race and gender is more popular in this topic, but like LGBTQ and
Yeah.
this ability, like this
Yeah.
identity are still kind of like
Yeah.
invisible when we're representing intersection.
Yes.
I would love to
yeah.
be more to give a small conversation on that.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I think, so I think that we are, early intersectionality work, it was just enough to see black women as black women, right? And not black men or white women. That in terms of kind of Kimberly's argument, and it comes from this, there was a lawsuit that a group of black women filed against General Motors. So this is back in the 80s. And their argument was that they weren't being promoted into managerial roles, and that they were having a specific experience that was different from black men and from white women, because those groups actually were getting promoted, but black women specifically were not getting promoted. And the court rejected their claim that they had no standing, because they had to prove that black men were also getting passed over, and that white women were also getting passed over. And their argument was that we're not black men or white women, we're black women. And so the early work on intersectionality was enough to just take up and see that black women were an independent group, that they could have standing. Ironically, later, the automakers, and in particular General Motors, created a program where they targeted students of color coming out of HBCUs to go into managerial. So they were hired directly into managerial. Most of the people they hired were black men in engineering. So from a lawsuit that black women filed because they weren't seen, again, as subjects independent of black men and white women, this notion of so Kimberly was arguing that we have to see them as a category in and of themselves. And so the other nuances, that this is a part of the more contemporary discourse, is that, well, yes, I am a woman, but I also may not be able-bodied, right? I also may not speak English as my first language. I also may be queer. So that there are other nuances that impact not only my gender and my race, but there are other things at play, particularly in the US, where we know that these categories are marginalized, right? These identities are marginalized. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We have time for a couple more. I'm going to invite people to stand by me past this mark point. Be brave. Seems to be something on that side of the room.
Hi everyone, my name is Francisca. I
And I would like to follow with the Grace question, because we can see nowadays that women have higher number in higher education, in graduate and undergraduate program. Nonetheless, women are not represented in higher position as dean, vice provost, differently than men that who have more position. So, do you believe that nowadays researchers have only focused in gender and race categories to analyze intersectionality? Because even though you say now there are a few researchers who work with other identities, I feel when I read the literature review, I only find analysis about gender and race. So is it possible that it's a problem with us as researchers, that we are not open to expand our research?
Mhm. Well, I think it depends on how you're accessing the data. So some places don't capture sexual identity, right? Because there are political reasons, right, and safety reasons. You don't have to disclose your sexual identity. Other identities are more obvious, right? But for a lot of reasons, we don't necessarily capture sexual identity. So it's hard if you're using particular databases. As a qualitative researcher, perhaps I can ask that question in a way that, as qualitative researchers, we can mask certain things so we can protect people's identities. In quantitative research, it's a little difficult if it's not asked, right? If it's not a category that we necessarily capture. In terms of disability, I think it's captured in some databases, but again, when we do survey, it's not always captured. So it's where are we getting the data from? And the limits of these databases are some of the problem when we do these kind of large analyses about kind of in the academy, who is going into leadership, et cetera. They tend to look at single identities. So it's a limitation of our data sets. Yeah.
Maybe one more?
Good morning, Dr. Dixon.
Good morning.
My quick question is, where do you see the future of intersectionality research going? What should we expect in the next 5 or 10 years on this topic?
Yeah. I think some critical scholars are pushing back against this, that we haven't thought more complexly about class in the model, and that most of our research has tended to look at professional Black women, middle class Black women, and not interrogated more robustly the impact that class status has on race and gender, and even queerness to a certain extent. So I think, although critical race theorists, we think about race, we don't throw out class, but that in some ways has been under articulated in the research.
One final one.
Good morning. My name is Marines. I'm also a higher education scholar, but also a legal scholar. So my focus is more about how we are integrating in intersectionality other identities that we came not just from the international areas, but also as a individual with the same rights. I'm talking about status as not just immigrants, but also non-immigrants would affect a lot of international students who are not non-immigrants living in a country that we have the same rights as immigrants, however not the same benefits came to us in that direction. So I'm interested if you have seen in your research or your knowledge this kind of studies from the legal perspective.
So, can I think of this in legal? I don't know off the top of my head. Names escape me right now. But I can get back to you on that, Marines. I'm going to say EPS showed up. Yay, EPS! But I'll find that information for you, Dennis. Thank you.